So welcome everyone. My name is Sanjyot Mehendale and I serve as the chair of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies. So I want to welcome everybody to our workshop on book technology along the Silk Roads. We are very excited to bring together teachers, university faculty, researchers, students, and community members. A special welcome to our guests from the Mongolian Consulate, Consul General Munkbatar. Welcome. There you are. Consul Orkhon Tulga. And Vice Consul Kongurzul. Is she here? Yeah. I also want to say a special welcome to Angaragsuren Odkhuu. I don't know whether you're in the room right now. Our visiting scholar from Mongolia, from the National Library in Mongolia. We're also delighted, and I'm not sure whether she is here at the moment, Maggie Lindruth, U.S. Director of the American Center for Mongolian Studies, and of course, our other speakers today, Amanda Goodman and Gillian Boal, right up front here. So today's workshop looks at the materials, formats, scripts, and technologies that shape book culture across the Silk Roads. So we'll discuss how paper, ink, wood blocks, bindings, illuminated pages tell stories of cultural contact, exchange, creativity, and transformation, and reshaped how knowledge was preserved and shared. Now, many UC Berkeley centers run K through 12 outreach programs to help connect advanced research with early education, to spark curiosity in our younger students. These programs aim to increase exposure to academic scholarship and inspire students to pursue higher education. They try to promote educational equity by providing resources to teachers and to those students who might not otherwise have access. Conversely, I think these programs give researchers and university students valuable experience in communication and community engagement. I'd argue that the Tang Center has one of the strongest K through 12 outreach programs on this campus, maybe beyond this campus. And that is largely thanks to Karen Clancy, our Director of Development. Yes. Anyone who knows her will tell you that she rarely stands still and brings incredible energy and joy to everything she does. And she's a dedicated UC Berkeley alum. She's a former UC Berkeley regent and lifelong educator. Our program is really as robust as it is because about 2 decades ago, Karen and Leslie Tang Schilling launched an outreach program, an outreach initiative on China that grew into a model program under the Fulbright framework and has since brought international attention to the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies. As this workshop and the broader program on Mongolia is really Karen's vision, I'm just along for the ride. It's time for me then to stop talking and invite Karen up to share a few words about the program and also the work ahead this weekend. So please help me welcome Karen Clancy.
I'd just like to welcome all of you today. It was so nice to see some friendly faces. I don't do this alone, and so I wanted to also introduce Sherry Ho, who's our curriculum advisor, who has come with us to many programs. Also, before we start, I do want to point out our visiting scholar, the very first visiting scholar for the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies, Dr. Angaragsuren Odkhuu from the National Library of Mongolia, who's going to be here. So you'll get to hear from him later today. So that will be wonderful. Sanjyot was so gracious to talk about our program. We started it in 2007. And actually, we have one teacher who was from that 2007 program to China, Steve Pomeroy from Ralston Middle School. And so, but I would like all of the teachers who have been on our programs to please stand, because it's because of them that we are able to do so much work. So we have teachers, and in 2024, for the very first time, we brought librarians and included them in our program. But if you go to our website under K-12, you can take a look at some of the wonderful lessons that these teachers have done. Many of them are nationally recognized teachers who have done incredible work throughout California that's being recognized actually throughout the world. And so we're really pleased about the work that these teachers are doing to spread the idea of a more global community and multicultural education really throughout the world, and specifically in their classrooms in California. So thank you to all of you, and thank you for all of you to come support this program and what we're doing. The speakers that we have today that we'll introduce have been part of our program that we've known through the Tang Center and through other programs with UC Berkeley, but we're really thrilled to have you all here. And so thank you so much. I hope you enjoy the day and that you learn about things and you look at books in a different way. So I guess I'll start with our first speaker, who is Dr. Amanda Goodman. So Amanda Goodman is a scholar of medieval Chinese Buddhism whose research focuses on the transmission of Buddhist texts and rituals across Asia, with particular attention to the Dunhuang manuscript archive. She received her Ph.D. from the University of California, Berkeley, go Bears, and has taught courses in Buddhist studies and Silk Road studies for more than 15 years. Her work examines how Buddhist texts were copied, circulated, and transformed across the Eastern Silk Road. She is currently developing a book-length project entitled Early Buddhist Books, which explores how the material forms of manuscripts shape the preservation and transmission of Buddhist traditions along the Silk Road. And so I have actually visited archives with Dr. Goodman, and she has an incredible knowledge and reach for being able to understand the manuscripts, but show you things that you wouldn't think of looking at when you see a manuscript. So I'm pleased to have her with us. Thank you.
Well, let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be here with you today. I am deeply grateful to Karen and Sherry and Sanjyot for the invitation, and to all of you for participating in this remarkable collective project, which has taken you across sections of the Silk Road, from China, including Dunhuang, to Mongolia, and to the collections of the British Library in London, a modern center for the study of the Silk Road and one of my favorite places in the world. As educators, we try to understand something. When we try to understand something as vast as the Silk Road, we face a challenge. How do we make long centuries, distant places, and complex networks of exchange intelligible? How do we move from an abstract map of routes and regions to the lived realities of the people who traveled them, traded along them, and built communities across them? How do we take what feels remote and make it relatable today for our students, so that we can glimpse something of the past and recognize it as part of our shared human inheritance? One way historians approach this challenge is by looking closely at the objects people made, used, and carried with them, objects that preserve traces of movement, contact, and exchange. And today I would like to suggest one such lens, the early book. So you all have been studying the Silk Road not simply as a trade route, but as a network of exchange of goods, technologies, languages, religions, artistic forms, and systems of knowledge. And this morning, I want to focus on one of the most powerful vehicles of that exchange, again, the early book. For many centuries, the scroll was the dominant book form, flexible but fragile, and well-suited to continuous linear reading. Around the 1st century CE, a new format began to appear, what we call the codex, made of stacked sheets bound along one edge. In its simplest sense, a book is a physical artifact that takes one of two major forms, the scroll or the codex. For millennia, the scroll, made from materials such as papyrus, parchment, leather, and later paper, served as the standard format for storing written texts. Long sheets were joined together and rolled for storage, producing the familiar form of the scroll. Between the 1st and the 6th centuries of the Common Era, however, the codex gradually replaced that form and shifted how we organize and access written knowledge. The codex introduced something that now feels completely familiar to us, the page. By stacking and binding sheets together, the codex made it possible to flip through a text, compare passages more easily, and navigate large bodies of writing with greater efficiency. In this sense, the codex did not simply change the appearance of the book, it transformed how text could be organized, consulted, taught, and transmitted. Across different regions, we also encounter a wide variety of book forms, loose-leaf manuscripts, folded formats, and hybrid solutions that combine elements of several traditions. These differences were not simply matters of shape or convenience. They reflect broader techniques for organizing, preserving, reading, and transmitting written knowledge. By techniques, I mean the material systems that made knowledge portable, repeatable, and durable, the writing surfaces on which texts are recorded, the formats into which those surfaces are arranged, the scribes who copy them, and the institutions that preserve and authorize them. A book, in this sense, is a portable medium fashioned from a wide range of materials, designed to store and transmit different kinds of information, often both textual and visual. These materials are shaped into specific formats, again, scrolls, stitched or bound pages, folded books, loose leaves, sometimes protected by wooden boards or textile covers. And we'll see some of that in the slideshows today and then again in the workshop tomorrow. Books also record language through conventional writing systems linked to particular linguistic communities, and in many cases through multiple scripts. And those scripts are arranged visually across the page, and sometimes this can be wildly exciting to look at. Taken together, these material and visual features tell us a great deal about how books were actually used. A scroll requires different reading practices than a codex. A bamboo strip archive demands different storage and handling than a palm leaf manuscript collection. Page-based formats allow easier navigation and cross-reference, while scrolls encourage sequential readings. These differences shape not only how texts are accessed, but how they are memorized, taught, interpreted. In this sense, books' forms do not merely carry knowledge, they help shape it. The physical structure of a book influences how texts are read. A scroll unfolds sequentially, guiding the reader through a continuous narrative, and often difficult to skip ahead to an important section you remember from the last time you went through it, while, again, page-based formats make it easier to find exactly what you're looking for. As reading practices evolve, they reshape how knowledge itself is organized and transmitted across generations. So this is part of what I would call the world of the early book, and we might also refer to this as manuscript culture, a world of handwritten documents through which knowledge was preserved and shared. Different materials encourage experimentation in how words were recorded, organized, and circulated across distances and communities. That dynamic became especially visible along the Silk Road, where languages, scripts, imperial powers, and religious traditions were in constant contact. If we want to understand how ideas moved across Eurasia, how religion spread, how empires stabilized, and how administrative cultures expanded, we must look not only at what was transmitted, but also at the material technologies that made that transmission possible. So before turning to specific manuscript cultures, we need to ask a more basic question. What exactly was the Silk Road, and what role did the book play within it? Now, I know you're all Silk Road experts, and that you know that the Silk Road was never a single road. The term itself was coined in the 19th century and conjured the image of a transcontinental trade artery linking China and the Roman world, and for the past several decades, drawing on archaeological, art historical, and textual discoveries, scholars have been trying to complicate that image. So what we find instead of the Silk Road is a shifting web of connections: desert routes, mountain passes, oasis towns, imperial courts, monasteries, caravan routes, and market centers, linking regions and nodes across Eurasia over many centuries. Across that web moved far more than silk. Goods circulated, but so did technologies, languages, religions, artistic motifs, again, administrative systems, and scientific and medical knowledge. The Silk Road reshaped civilizations, not only economically, but intellectually and culturally. So I'm assuming everyone is basically familiar with the Silk Road map. So we have what is essentially the northern and the southern Silk Roads that skirt the Taklamakan, and then you see points further west and points leading east into China. What I've highlighted here on a kind of zoomed in version of the previous map is some of the major sites from which we have collected the most robust archives of early books along the Silk Road. So along the southern road, we have the sites of Khotan, we have Nia, and on this top we have a couple of sites, including Turfan, there it is, and Dunhuang, which many of you know well. So the early book was not the mass-produced, printed, or now digitized object we recognize today. It was a handwritten and portable object that appeared in many different material forms. Before the widespread adoption of paper, writing surfaces varied widely across regions. Among the most common were clay tablets in Mesopotamia, papyrus in Egypt and the Greco-Roman world, parchment and vellum made from treated animal skins, bamboo and wooden slips in early China, birch bark in Gandhara and other regions, palm leaves in South and Southeast Asia, silk, and eventually paper in China, and all of these were spreading. But these materials were not interchangeable. They individually shaped what a book could be. Material shaped format, and the format shaped use. So for example, papyrus sheets were glued together into long scrolls, again encouraging that continuous reading, making it difficult to flip ahead or skip sections. Parchment could be folded and sewn into codices, stacked bound pages that allowed easier navigation. Palm leaves were cut into long receptacles and strung together into loose-leaf manuscripts. Among the most transformative of these materials was paper. Invented in China, likely as early as the 2nd century BCE, paper-making gradually spread westward across the Silk Road to Central Asia, to Baghdad, and eventually into Europe. Paper transformed the infrastructure of written culture. It lowered the cost of writing, it increased portability, it allowed text to be produced in far greater numbers, and it made copying less labor-intensive. When the cost of writing drops, the scale of documentation expands. And I've been on this sort of kick recently thinking about administrative systems and how paper and early books sort of facilitated the spread and exchange of administrative culture. So with paper, more copies can be made, larger compilations can be assembled, administrative states can maintain more extensive records, and monasteries can build larger libraries. In short, paper altered the scale of textual culture across Eurasia. Yet paper was only one writing support circulating along these routes. So again, I just showed a slide with some examples. But here we have a birch bark manuscript from a Buddhist monastery in the region that we call Gandhara, which is in modern Afghanistan and Pakistan. And these documents were originally rolled up, for the most part, rolled up and stored in sealed jars, which were buried in the ground, and so they were so well preserved. So these are the oldest extant examples of Buddhist writing that we have, and they are written in different scripts, mostly Kharoshthi and Gandhari, I think. And so this is our earliest Buddhist form of the book, okay? And I just wanted to show this image, which might be familiar to many of you, which is an early form of bookbinding in China, where they would take strips of bamboo or other types of wood and link them together with string to bind them. So this is a kind of rudimentary binding system. And then paper, of course, will come in and replace some of these early forms of the book in China. So each region along the Silk Road developed its own manuscript ecology, documentary practices shaped by climate, political authority, religious institutions, and local craft traditions. Again, temple libraries flourished with the rise of paper, imperial archives were maintained, merchants circulated texts alongside goods and kept commercial records, monastic scholars copied, preserved, taught, and transmitted texts in this medium. These systems were not isolated. The Silk Road functioned as an environment in which different systems of textual transmission interacted. So transmission was rarely linear, and that's sort of one of the fun parts about working in old or early book archives, is that you see all kinds of interesting hybrids and forms of experimentation. So texts traveled, were translated, were reformatted, and sometimes circulated back, transformed from their original form. So we see all kinds of, again, experimentation happening in the early book archives. Let us see. So for this reason, it can be helpful to speak not only of the Silk Road, but also what we might call the book roads. And in fact, the phrase book roads was originally coined by the sinologist Wang Yong to describe the circulation of texts between China and Japan. So typically, we think of exchange happening between East and West, sort of ending in China and going as far west as the Mediterranean. And what Wang Yong noted, which is what all scholars of East Asia know, is that there's a tremendous amount of trade that happens in other regions, or sort of extensions of the Silk Road. And so he was looking at contact between China and Japan and Korea, where we see tremendous amounts of exchange, specifically around print technologies and transmission of Buddhist writing. More recently, scholars like Susan Huang have extended this idea to show how networks of book production, copying, and circulation connected Buddhist communities across much wider regions of Asia, and she calls this the Buddhist book road. So we see a kind of layering of this idea, or the metaphor of a road of exchange of material culture and technologies. So if we think about the Buddhist book roads, which is what I spend a lot of time thinking about, we can formulate some specific questions within this larger framework about transmission on the Silk Road. So within this framework of the Buddhist book roads, books do not simply pass through networks, they help generate networks of their own. They create communities of teaching, again, interpretation, copying, and storage. They link monasteries, courts, translation bureaus, and scriptoria across vast distances. And again, some of that is evidence in things like colophons and marginalia on some of the manuscripts that we see preserved from this Buddhist book roads. And in one extraordinary place, we can observe these systems of transmission in cross-section. And that place is Dunhuang. So here's just another view of the Silk Road, and as you can see here, Dunhuang, hopefully you can see it, I'm not sure, I have a pointer, is here on the western edge of our green line, headed into central China and the medieval Chinese capital of Chang'an. So this is a very famous picture that you're probably all familiar with, which is Cave 16, which is the shrine cave here, and the side chamber, which has been identified as Cave 17, which is also known as the library cave. Again, how many of you have actually been to Dunhuang, just to get a sense? More. That's a very rare and impressive thing, to stand in front of a group of people and almost everyone raises their hand. Okay. All right, I got nothing more to say actually then, but I'll just keep reading my script. And I'll just put this image up because this is my manuscript muse called Pelio, inside Cave 17, studying the manuscripts by candlelight. So So to see these dynamics more concretely, we turn to one of the most extraordinary sites along the Silk Road, the Mogao Cave Complex near the oasis town of Dunhuang in present-day Gansu Province, China. Located at the edge of the Gobi Desert, near the convergence of caravan routes linking China and Central Asia and beyond, the Mogao Caves form a vast network of Buddhist shrines carved into a cliff face. In 1900, a small sealed chamber was rediscovered there, Cave 17, again, the so-called library cave. When the chamber was opened, it revealed not a curated library in the modern sense, but a dense accumulation of material. Bundles of scrolls, folded books, printed sheets, and loose manuscripts. In total, tens of thousands of manuscripts and printed texts were preserved there, dating roughly from the 4th to the early 11th centuries. In a single space, we encounter nearly 700 years of textual life. This is the Buddhist Book Roads. These manuscripts include scrolls, booklets, concertina-style books, illustrated sutras, ritual manuals, administrative records, contracts, personal notes, diaries, canonical scriptures, and locally produced compositions that kind of baffle one. This was not a planned archive, or was it? Questions continue to surround the original nature and function of the library cave. What we do know is that it represents an accumulation, materials copied, handled, annotated, repaired, stored, and eventually sealed by those living in the region. Many of these manuscripts can be linked to local temples and individuals through stamps and colophones and inscriptions and labels attached either to the documents themselves or to their covers in which they were stored. Their preservation emerged from a combination of institutional habits, practical storage decisions, and environmental conditions. The dry desert climate made their survival possible, but what survived was also shaped by use, reuse, and circumstances that may still lie beyond our full understanding. Dunhuang, while remote and sometimes cut off from central China, was a regional node embedded within wider networks, connected at different times to the Tang Empire, to the Tibetan Empire, and to neighboring regions such as Khotan, Turfan, and the rest of Central Asia, so some of those circled places on that Silk Road map I just showed. So Dunhuang allows us to see Buddhism not as abstract doctrine, but as lived tradition, bound by texts that were copied, commissioned, annotated, and taught, repaired, reused, and archived. In other words, Dunhuang gives us a picture of Buddhism on the ground, a working text-centered tradition, but one that was also rich in visual and ritual expression. And the manuscripts themselves reveal how those systems operated. Multiple book forms coexist within this collection, and we're going to look at some in a moment. Again, marginal notes, interlinear glosses, corrections, and annotations in multiple hands, sometimes on a single manuscript, reveal an active pedagogical and ritual communities. Reuse appears throughout the archive, and for me, reuse and repurposing of manuscripts is one of the most exciting facets of the Dunhuang collection. Manuscripts were sometimes copied over earlier administrative documents, revealing the life cycle of texts and the institutional decisions that shaped preservation and sometimes erasure. Because the archive spans many centuries, we can observe transmission unfolding over time. The Dunhuang archive is layered, almost geological, layer upon layer of copying, teaching, adaptation, reuse, and preservation. Dunhuang allows us to glimpse the Buddhist book roads, again in cross-section, not as abstraction, but as material practice. And here we clearly see what books do. They stabilize language, organize knowledge, and allow traditions to move, adapt, experiment, and endure across time and space. So seen from a wider angle, Dunhuang belongs to a larger story of Eurasian book cultures. Comparing writing supports, formats, and repair practices across regions helps us to see how transmission depended on shared material problems, portability, durability, and legibility, even when traditions differed in their language and religion and the manuscripts differed in purpose. Before focusing exclusively on the Silk Road, we need a broader frame. If the Silk Road is an abstraction, the books can be just as slippery. So maybe I'll ask an even more rudimentary question, which, what is a book? So for me, when I first started studying the Silk Road and manuscript cultures, seeing a strip of paper did not exactly conform with my model of what a book was. So a scroll, I guess my imagination could see how this was a book, but seeing strips of papers bound together or not. So it sort of stretches what we mean by a book, at least in the contemporary sense. So in its simplest sense, a book is a physical artifact designed to store and transmit information. In the manuscript world, as I mentioned earlier, two major forms dominated, the scroll and the codex, along with related folded and loose leaf formats that lie somewhere in between the scroll and the codex. These could be written by hand or later printed using woodblocks or xylographs and later movable type. But a book is more than a writing surface. It's a portable medium made from specific materials, organized into formats that shape how a text is arranged and accessed. So across Eurasia, manuscript cultures experimented with different solutions to this basic problem, how to organize their written knowledge so that it could be transmitted effectively. And each of the specific book formats here on the screen are attempts to solve this problem in slightly different ways. So again, my focus is primarily on early Buddhist books, so I'm going to be using examples from Buddhist manuscripts and records of Buddhist textual traditions across the Silk Road. But of course, there are other traditions represented, and we'll dip into a couple of those here in the talk. But the scroll is one of the oldest and most widespread book forms. And I just wanted to show this is an early Gandharan relief, a sort of narrative sculpture, and it shows, if you can tell, a group of monks debating, and they're actually holding scrolls. So I don't know if you can see the scroll hanging down. And I've pointed arrows at some of the lines on the sides of the scroll in order to show you the kind of continuity of practices. So here in this rock-cut story of this great debate over a great text, which they have in hand, we can see similarities in some of the early birch bark examples that were excavated from this same region. So you can see some of the same features, you can see the lines on the side. So they were carving in relief what they were using in the birch bark versions of the scroll, so this is very exciting. So you can see the thread and the binding, and there are additional reading marks. It might be a little hard to see, but in that circle is a kind of design which is probably used as something like a highlighter. Right? A more familiar version, perhaps, of a scroll from Dunhuang. So this would be what we would call a hand scroll, and this is an image of some haloed figure holding a hand scroll like that found in the manuscript sample from the library cave. So I love seeing the interplay between the actual physical objects and the way they're presented in the artistic and archaeological records. So just to give you a sense of some of the hand scrolls that I myself have worked on, just because they're incredible to look at, is this Paléo-Chinois. So this is a manuscript now contained in the National Library of France, which also has a large, like the British Library, a large holding of Dunhuang manuscripts. And this is a hand scroll with an intact roller tie and frontispiece that all date to the 10th century. So this is a remarkably well-preserved example of an early Buddhist book in the form of a scroll. So you can see the sort of fabrication techniques that are at use here with the frontispiece that's decorated on the front and the back. And here's a detailed image of how the tie was affixed to the manuscript. There's a wooden roller there at the top that it was sunk into. And you can get a sense of some of the color of the annotation. Maybe not, but it's in a bright red color against the black ink, against the manuscript itself. And here's just one more example. If you unroll the scroll and you read it across from, oh my gosh, right to left, you see all kinds of other interesting evidence of the use of this hand scroll. So you see again the annotation where the arrow is pointing, these different ways of marking sections of the text using a differently colored ink than the main text in black. And then the section highlighted in the square is an example of a correction. So we used to use that whiteout, right? So this is a medieval whiteout technique. And so they had incorrectly copied some section of the text. So you can see a section at the top and then also at the bottom. So it's slightly differently colored. So this is an attempt to correct a text that had been copied. Another format that is very common among the Dunhuang manuscripts, but one that we see across Buddhist Asia, is the poti. And this is ubiquitous book format derived from an Indian form. And we see this being implemented in slightly different ways across Central Asia, and including at Dunhuang. This is an example from India. But I wanted to show you, again, sort of as a documentary, an attempt at documentation. We have an early wall painting, which is depicting this time Buddhist scribes, and we see these kinds of depictions across the Buddhist world where they're holding the poti sheet and they're learning, writing down the lessons from the teacher who is instructing them. So they're sitting at the feet of the teacher, writing out, copying their texts on their poti sheets. These are other examples of birch bark poti. So these poti can be made of different materials. So in South Asia, we tend to see palm leaf. In this more Central Asian region, in Gandhara, we see birch bark being used. So again, the birch bark manuscripts from this Gandharan region are our earliest surviving Buddhist books. And you can see some specificities of this format, including the hole at the center, which of course was used to thread a string, which would be a kind of rudimentary binding. Okay. These are other examples from Central Asia, written in different scripts, but you see a kind of remarkable continuity in the physical form, the rectangular shape, the use of holes, placement of holes at the center, one or two, used to bind. And eventually over time, as we see in manuscript culture, some of these sort of technical features of a book form become stylized. So at a certain point, including at Dunhuang, we continue to see the holes used for binding, but they become ornamental. There's no evidence that string ever passed through them. And so this is an interesting feature, right? So the shape and the format, including even an old binding system, is retained even though it's no longer used. So that's very interesting. So we see a Tocharian poti at the top, which might excite you if you knew how rare Tocharian is. It's an old Indo-European language about which we still don't know so much. And then at the bottom we have a Tibetan poti, and you can see the two holes here, the same rectangular shape. Yeah. Now here I wanted to just step outside of the Buddhist book roads for 1 second to talk about another possible set of influences on the Buddhist book tradition, which is the Manichaean book tradition. And so with Karen and a few other people from Berkeley, we had the chance to go to Berlin to look at some of their Silk Road book collections, and we came across this image of an illuminated Manichaean poti book. So this is not a Buddhist book, but a Manichaean tradition. So this is a Central Asian religion, and they use the same basic format. So you can see the rectangular shape, you can see the hole in the center, and you can see the illumination or the illustration. And this is just an example from what we were able to see in Berlin. So you can see the color on the cover with the figure and the extra.
Paper or...
Yes, yeah, and this is probably 10th century, is that what it says? Yes, so this is also a 10th century manuscript, and 9th and 10th century manuscript is really the bulk of the material that I work with, the bulk of the Tibetan and the Chinese poti. So the same rough date. And again, there are many, many historical questions that still remain to be answered about the relationship between Manichaean book culture and Buddhist book culture, but they seem very closely aligned. And here we can see an example of that in the physical formats. So just a couple of fun things to foreshadow some of what we might hear about later. Not only were they sharing these different physical manuscript book formats and the conventions for using them, like so preparing the paper, the way the script is added to the text and so forth, but also some of the techniques for storing and carrying such text. So here what we're actually seeing, if you can see it, is a little satchel, a little book wrapper here. So I've blown it. It's a little easier to see actually in black and white. So on the far side left, you can see the satchel. Maybe not the best blow up there, but then you can see a leather wrapper that was discovered somewhere a little farther west on the Silk Road. But this is the kind of object that people would have used to carry such manuscripts. So there are, again, layers and layers of techniques used in the creation of the paper, the copying of the sutra, the adding of color, and the carrying or storage of these books. This is another example of a Tibetan tantric manual from Dunhuang that uses a similar format. And I bring this one back up because we have a parallel text written in Chinese which uses this same format. So this is actually quite fun because, as you likely know, Chinese is written from top to bottom, right to left. But the poti traditionally is held this way, right? And you flip the pages up and you keep going through the stack. In the Chinese case, in the Chinese poti from Dunhuang, they shift the direction, so it becomes this way, and you flip them this way. So this is very fun. So they took the same basic shape, the same basic format. They retained the features, the dimensions of the sheets, the way they were ruled, and the binding technique with the center hole. But they adapted them to a Chinese style. So here you can see the Chinese writing, and you also see this beautiful coloring on the side. So this is a flaming jewel, a very common Buddhist motif that they use to sort of decorate, to illuminate the sides of this manuscript. And this is just to give you a sense of the sort of size or scale of these. So this is a big bundle. This is also a text in the National Library of France, in Paris. And you can see, again, another example of how the Chinese adapted this book format. And you can, again, this is a modern string, but this is possibly what the book would have looked like in use in roughly the 10th century in Greater Dunhuang. And again, you can see some of the annotations, some of the highlighter marks that are used there to identify new sections of the text, the name of the translator, mantras or Buddhist spells. So they're using very similar techniques across all the languages, including the Manichaean texts that use this common poti style. So turning to another book format that we see, we have the accordion or the concertina, and this appears to be a synthesis of traditional book forms of both China and India, which is a very interesting idea. So one way of conceiving of the concertina is as a folded scroll. So you have a long piece of paper and you're going to fold it into an accordion shape. So it's actually a quite simple technique. But this format also shares similarities with the Chinese poti format because of its size. So that rectangular shape is a very common form of the accordion or concertina book that we see in Buddhist communities, including at Dunhuang. But I wanted to show you some other shapes. So they're not all long rectangular poti-like concertinas. We have smaller book-like, codex-like compilation. So this is a Chinese concertina that I have worked on, also in Paris. And you can see its size. So the pencil is there to give you a sense of the size or scale of the book. But you can see all sorts of fun stuff happening here. So this was the personal handbook of a monk who left his name on the front cover. And he's just copying texts that likely were of interest to him or may have been used in a kind of pedagogical or ritual context. And sometimes he made mistakes. So here we see this lovely page from his concertina book, and he had left out an important line from the text. And so he had recycled a piece of paper from another manuscript, added the line, glued it to the page, and then now when you open it, it looks like this, but once you start to open the pages, all kinds of these additions and add-ons fall out. So this is the sort of middle towards end of this concertina. If we start to unfold it, and I'm not sure how well you can see, but there's different types of texts, including some meditation manuals, and they're using layout and they're using the addition of color to try and highlight not only the shift in text from text A to text B to text C, but also how to use and read individual texts. And so these are some of the only surviving copies of the ritual text preserved on this particular manuscript. And if we open it further up, we see all kinds of reuse of paper, we see more additions, we see some kind of interesting looking glyphs and graphs and all kinds of mnemonics being laid out here on the manuscript. So I spent one day with this thing in Paris trying to unfold it and make sense of it, and it's actually quite wonderful because, as I mentioned earlier, reuse and repurposing is a major feature of all manuscript cultures, including those at Dunhuang. And what's so wonderful about the repurposed sheet used to create this hand diagram, which is seen at the top if you unfold it, what's beneath it is a dated document from a local government bureau. So we know exactly when that paper was produced, which was the year 980. And so we know that this manuscript, or at least this section of the manuscript, this inserted section of the manuscript, was made at no earlier than 980 CE. So that's one of the ways that we use the manuscripts themselves to help date the different textual traditions that we see preserved at the site. And this is just a close-up of one of those meditation manuals. So here on the side you have these 5 syllables to be recited like mantras, and they're making these lines towards the different lines that are explicating the significance of each of these Buddhist syllables. So again, this is a very rare text, but quite lovely to look at. And this is just that hand insert, which again, if you unfold it down, you get that dated, recycled administrative document. So this is a Buddhist finger sealing manual, so there are different pressure points on the hand, and the text at the top, which you have to turn the other side around to read, is giving you a gloss of what each of these pressure points on the finger signify. And just one more, because I love these texts. This is another scroll that has the same text that we just saw on that concertina booklet with the mantras, the seed syllables with their exegesis. So this is another copy I found. So we have a copy, 2 copies in the world of this text, one on a recycled Dunhuang concertina and the other on a recycled scroll. So they're both dated to the same year. So someone was presumably very active in the late 10th century working with these meditation texts. And just for fun, I wanted to show you one other example of the types of things we see at Dunhuang. So we have these different and unique book formats, but again, they're being used in a very localized way. So one of the big mysteries about Dunhuang is the nature of the local community, to the extent that it was Chinese or Tibetan or some other local inhabitants. And we get lots of evidence, specifically in the 9th and 10th century, of bilingual scribes or manuscripts that were being used by multiple communities. So we have a Chinese text with a Tibetan commentary added to it. But what, again, is so interesting is that to read the Chinese, you have to hold it vertically. And when you want to read the Tibetan, you have to turn it and read it horizontally. And they're using different codes, a lettering system, to label the Tibetan citations. And they're also using different, I'm not sure if you can see it too well, Chinese little glyphs, little marks, to note when it's the primary text and when it's the commentary to the primary text. And then the Tibetan primary text is used to sort of orient the whole thing. So it's very interesting. So to read one of these, you have to know how to hold it and which direction, and each direction goes with a different language. So these are the kinds of sort of textual realities we see preserved at Dunhuang. So the last form that we'll talk about is what we might just call the codex or the book. And by this, we really mean like a stitched book. So technically, a codex is a book that consists of one or more choirs or gatherings. And these gatherings comprise several bifolia stacked together and folded in half, and then sewn together in the middle. So you get a series of woven bifolia that are then all bound together to create what we would call a codex or a book. And so this looks a lot like the books we're used to today. And there are roughly 400 extant thread-bound books at Dunhuang. So this constitutes a major section or subsection of the Dunhuang book collection. So this was a very new method of putting a book together for the Chinese. So it's very unique. This is the start of something big and grand in the Chinese book tradition. So we'll just look at a couple of simple examples. So the most rudimentary form of what we might call a codex is just this single stitch binding. So you can see the red thread at the top of each of these books. So there are these small cut pages, which are somewhat square in shape. And they represent, often we see many versions of this single stitch book that contain just a section of the famous Lotus Sutra, one of the most popular Mahayana Buddhist sutras. And as you can see, they were very interested in this chapter because of the powerful parable that it holds, and they illustrated all of these as well. So these are all illuminated single stitched books. Okay? And these are very dramatic images from very dramatic stories in the Lotus. But you can see how they've divided the page in half. So the top register is for the illustration, and the bottom register is for the text itself. And so you would flip through it, and I imagine you maybe occasionally, if I tried to make one of these myself, you have to make sure you kind of keep it all together so that it doesn't rip. And we do have examples at Dunhuang where the stitch fell out, and so they've tried to sew it or remedy it, or sometimes not. We just find loose pages. So another common codex style or book style that we see at Dunhuang is called the stab-stitched book. So you can maybe get a sense of the different technique here. So rather than having a single stitch, the center of two pages coming together, you get something that looks more like what we think of as the edge binding. And the threads that were used or have been studied by different scholars, and the colors used to dye them. And so there's a whole world here bound up in this little bound book. And so this is just a diagram that was created by Colin Chinnery, who was working at the International Dunhuang Project at the British Library. So you've likely seen parts of this online, or maybe studied this document before. But it's a really helpful diagram for seeing how these book formats were structured and made. And this is really what we meant by the stitched gathering. So you have multiple gatherings that are all bound together to create a book. And this is how most of the books that we use today are actually structured. So this is an example of a Buddhist book with 6 gatherings. So here you can see the ruling of the page, the red string used to bind it together at the center, but you can get a sense of the different gatherings in the top image that all came together to form this book. And this is one of the books that I have worked on myself, and we might call this a hybrid book just because it's a codex, so it's a bound book made of all these gatherings, as you can see here on the side, and some of the stitching is coming apart, but it's been cut into the shape of the poti, right, or some of the concertina. So it looks like you might be able to read it as a poti, but actually it's a stitched book, and it's Chinese, so it's this kind of wonderful hybrid format. And this is just the other side, so you can see the bound side of the booklet and then the open side of the booklet, and you can see some Chinese graffiti that was written on the top. No idea who wrote it or why. But this is just to give you a sense of the book itself. And again, this book is in need of repair, so the stitches need to be redone. But again, this book is autographed on the back cover, and so it says, this is the book of Yuan Shou, meaning don't touch it. Okay? And there is a little proscription there at the bottom. And these kinds of things are actually really common in book cultures along the Silk Road. In Arabic books, you often see this. This book belongs to so-and-so, and if you touch it, there'll be serious consequences. So we have a version of that at Dunhuang. This is just my last example of a stitch book from Dunhuang, also in the Paleo collection in Paris. And this one is very neat because it's a slightly different shape than the previous slide, which again looks a bit like a poti with that long rectangular shape. This is more square. And it's made up of gatherings, as you can see. But again, this is a bilingual book, so it is Tibetan and Chinese. And so to read it, we have to be able to shift the book as we're going through it. So it's quite interesting. So this is the Tibetan orientation, and that's the Chinese orientation. So there are all these questions about who added which text. The overall manuscript is a Chinese manuscript, so the Tibetan editions were made at some point. By whom, we're not entirely sure, but it's a fascinating example. And before I go on, I just wanted to give you a sense of something that we're going to look at more tomorrow, which is the rise of printing at Dunhuang. At Dunhuang, we have, as you likely were told at the British Library, the oldest dated printed book in the world, which is dated May 11th, 868. It is preserved in the British Library. And it is a copy of the Diamond Sutra. And this was made from what we call a xylograph, or a wood block printing technique. So here you see the illumination on the side, followed by the text. And this is dated 866, but we actually have multiple copies of printed Diamond Sutras at Dunhuang, including some from the mid-10th century. And these are very interesting because they don't include the entire text, but just segments of the text, which for textualists is a very exciting problem. Why that section of the text? Why did it circulate independently? Was it always an independent text that was then brought together at some later date? So all those questions hold. But then also we see these colophons with the name of the person who commissioned the woodblock to have this print made. And again, we have multiple prints, presumably made from the same woodblock, preserved in the library cave at Dunhuang. And we'll talk more about the use of such prints as this single sheet. But we have all kinds of votive or devotional uses of printing. In addition to that commissioning of the Diamond Sutra that we just looked at, we see commission prints, often with long explanations of who commissioned the woodblock to be made, on what occasion, and the hope that the merit generated from the production of the woodblock and the prints could be transmitted to relatives and so forth. These are all dated, and they have different deities adorning the top. So again, we see the top register, which is usually the image, and the bottom register, which is text, which again is mimicked in the book formats that we see at Dunhuang as well. So they're taking lots of elements between what we might call poster culture and book culture to create these votive objects. And this is just once you start digging and looking for different copies made from the same woodblock, you start to see all kinds of things. You start to see dozens and dozens of preserved images made from the same woodblock. And we've done a little bit of analysis in the lab with technicians to make sure that we are looking at prints from the same woodblock. And we recently printed an article about this woodblock print of the deity Guanyin, or Avalokiteshvara, this bodhisattva. So, we can now ask more directly, what did books do? If we describe books as technologies of transmission, two clarifications are necessary. Transmission of what? Religious doctrine, ritual procedure, legal codes, administrative systems, medical knowledge, and scholarly commentary. That's all preserved at Dunhuang. Technology in what sense? Here I use technology or technique to refer to structured material systems that make certain actions possible and others difficult. Books stabilize language across distance. They fix phrasing, standardize terminology, and enable repetition at scale. They detach authority from bodily presence and embed it in material form. A monk in Dunhuang could copy a text translated in Chang'an. A scholar in Khotan could study a sutra composed in India. A ritual manual could circulate across linguistic boundaries at Dunhuang and survive beyond the lifespan of its compiler. The book reorganizes authority. Once written, authority no longer depends solely on memory or lineage. Text can be copied, translated, excerpted, reorganized, and canonized. Books are not only technical artifacts, they are also social objects. They are commissioned, copied, sponsored, repaired, recycled, and stored. They circulate within monasteries, courts, archives, and schools, and we have many examples from Dunhuang of students making notations about how boring and dry their teachers' lessons are, etc., etc., etc. Lots of doodles and images that we won't show. At Dunhuang, we see wear around string holes, missing boards reused elsewhere, annotations in multiple hands on a single manuscript, and text copied over administrative documents, as in the book I showed you earlier. These are not pristine exemplars. They are lived artifacts. The evolution of book formats was never purely technical. It was social. It was devotional. It was economical, and it was local. We know all of this because material culture survives unevenly. Preservation is not neutral. It is shaped by environment, circumstance, and chance. Paper, silk, and birch bark can endure in ways that they cannot in human regions, where organic materials disintegrate quickly. What survives, therefore, is contingent. Desert archives preserve not only canonical texts, but fragments, multilingual manuscripts, palimpsests, practice sheets, and administrative forms. Many of these were working documents, not carefully curated treasures, which is how we see them today. They were used, annotated, recycled, and stored. They show transmission, again, not in abstraction, but in practice. This is where codicology, the study of the book as material object, becomes essential. Codicology asks how paper was made, how sheets were assembled, how ink was prepared, how bindings were constructed, how corrections were made, and how documents were reused. Scholars rejoin fragments like puzzle pieces. They identify scribal hands, reconstruct original formats, and trace manuscript movement through colophon, seals, and material analysis. It's meticulous work, but when fragments reunite, networks appear. Recent scholarship on global connectivity has shown that material culture and the technologies involved in producing it can reveal networks that political or literary histories alone cannot always make visible. Manuscripts, pigments, fibers, and formats preserve traces of contact, adaptation, and exchange that formal narratives may overlook. At the same time, we are always working with fragments. We do not possess complete archives of the ancient Silk Road. We do not always know where manuscripts were produced, and we cannot always trace precise routes of transmission. Large systems are often reconstructed from small survivals. Connectivity must therefore be argued carefully. The Silk Road was not a seamless web. It was uneven, episodic, and historically contingent. What survives is partial, and what we reconstruct is provisional. And yet, the fragments are extraordinarily revealing. Changes in book technology reshape intellectual life. When writing moved onto paper, scale expanded and cost declined. When scrolls gave way to folded or stitched formats, navigation and comparison changed. When translation cultures flourished, authorities shifted across language, scripts, and institutions. Material form conditioned transmission, and transmission conditioned interpretation. When we step back from the details of manuscript formats and archives, a broader picture comes into view. The Silk Road was not only a corridor of exchange, it was an environment in which systems of transmission took shape. Across deserts and mountain routes, across monasteries, courts, and oasis towns, people developed ways to stabilize language, organize knowledge, and sustain traditions across generations. And at the center of that effort stood the early book. Handmade, portable, fragile, yet one of the most powerful technologies of transmission in the pre-modern world. Ideas and traditions endure because they are made material. Texts endure because they are copied, translated, repaired, and taught, and because someone, somewhere along the old Silk Road, chose to store them. Thank you.
So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Gillian Boal from the Boal Conservation. So she has worked as a book conservator for 45 years and acquired a wide range of experience in paper, books, and archives. She's also taught many classes as conducted oral histories. She trained at the Camberwell College of Arts and Crafts in London before apprenticing with Sidney Cockerell at the bookbinding firm of Douglas Cockerell & Son in Cambridge, England. She began her American career at the Northeast Document Conservation Center in Andover, Massachusetts, then moved to Berkeley and was employed at the UC Berkeley Library System for 23 years, mainly working for the Bancroft Library, East Asian Library, and other special collection libraries on campus. She retired from Berkeley in 2008. But in 2009, she moved to London to take up the position of Conservation and Collections Care Manager for the Wellcome Trust Holdings in Bloomsbury. She retired from the Wellcome Trust Library in 2016. She then moved back to the Bay Area after being away in the UK and took up employment at the Graduate Theological Union Library in Berkeley, retired a third time in June 2022. She established her own bindery, Boal Conservation, where she takes on private work, consulting and treatment for various institutions, including UC Berkeley's Law Library, and she hasn't retired a fourth time yet. So, but we were pleased to meet Gillian in London when we took our 2024 group to the British Library. And so it was at that time that she sort of planted the seed of doing a workshop on book technology and working with teachers. And so we were very pleased to have her here, and welcome.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Karen and Sanjyot, for inviting me here. I'm just amazed at the amount of retirements I've had myself, and I don't have the same amount of pensions, actually, but my career has been very varied, and you'll see from the slides that I've chosen. I'm going to show you a variety of items that I've been asked to treat over the years, concentrating on some of the treatment challenges and discoveries I made. I will introduce the conservation processes and a conservator's approach to the physical objects. Assessment and diagnosis of objects, treatment methods and techniques. And the first few slides are going to be a little boring. They're my professional side, and I have to do those, and then I can let loose. So just bear with me. So conservation principles. Throughout my career, I've treated many items from various cultures: Asian, Persian, Ethiopian, Arabic, and European, to name a few. Conserving principles emphasize preserving cultural heritage by stabilizing artifacts to prevent further deterioration while maintaining their historical integrity. Key concepts include reversibility, minimal intervention, and respect for the original materials and craftsmanship. Globally, conservation standards align with international international charters, such as the Venice Charter in 1964, which guide ethical preservation practices. The American Institute for Conservation is what we are all connected to as conservators, and we follow the ethics and guidelines of that institution. So, forensic work and initial examination. You need to understand the nature of the artifact in front of you. The initial examination combines visual inspection, photographic documentation, and non-invasive analytical techniques like X-ray fluorescence and infrared imaging. Accurate documentation establishes baseline condition records that are vital for tracking changes post-treatment and for future conservation reference and treatment decisions. So that's me being a conservator. I have to document everything. Choosing appropriate treatment strategies. The treatment strategies factors in object, material, condition, historical context, and conservation goals. Approaches may range from preservation via environmental control to active restoration. Decision-making is guided by risk assessment, likely outcomes, and ethical considerations. Okay, to do all this work, you need to have available the necessary tools and conservation materials for treating the artifacts. You need to understand the needs of the artifact in front of you through examination. And I'll show you a couple of workshops I attended to understand the making of materials and tools. Here they are. These are Conservator's working tools, mine to be exact. They borrow heavily from Asian practices. You can see Japanese brushes and knives. What is modern is using Teflon instead of bone for bone folders. I don't have any Teflon because this was taken a while ago. You can rub down directly onto a material without resulting in the folder leaving a shine. So that was a real plus for us. You didn't have to rub down to secure a mend. So you can do it directly. Otherwise, you had to use a barrier sheet. Okay, so paper history, I'm not going into this very much because I was leaving Manda to do all that wonderful explanation of the history of her various objects. So we've adopted several paper treatment practices from Asia, especially from the treatment of scrolls and screens. When flattening paper and repairing tears, we use mostly Asian papers and rice and wheat starch paste. Here is the Kari-Bari board in use, drying a piece of paper, slowly flattening it under tension. They have a much more sort of responsive way of treating things than the Western practice, which is to put it under boards and smash it flat so it doesn't move. But this is allowing any sort of raised imprinting from printing, the raisedness of printing. Otherwise, you'd flatten it, you know, because when you wet a paper, it expands and then it wants to contract. So we have to control that. That's actually something difficult to control. So I'm just going to show you this workshop I attended at Wellcome Library. It's taught by, I'll just get her name, Namiko Tagawa. And she came and she bought these cores, which are made out of cedar wood, because we didn't have time to make those as well. But here she is putting the first layer of paper on with a very thick paste. And so it slows and controls the drying rate of artifacts. So it's Japanese wheat starch paste strained and diluted, similar to the consistency of milk. And there I am, pasting up a piece of Japanese paper. She supplied all the paper that we would use. And then I'm tamping down the edges of the screen to make sure proper adhesion. And then these are the drying boards. You know, there were, I think, 10 in the workshop. So in pairs, we made drying boards. And they're at varying states of dry. I don't know if I explained, but you have to paste sheets either side, and there are about 6 to 8 sheets that you paste on. And it follows a tradition of making Kari-Bari boards. So we were taught well by her. And the boards, I just meant to, tell you, the board is finished by layering persimmon juice, which we didn't do in the workshop, but we did later. And you had 3 or 4 layers of it, letting it dry in between. And this is a Japanese paper lining, which is attached to the back of the object. And the extension of the lining paper are brushed onto the Kari-Bari board to hold the item in place. And the tab is, as you can see, that white tab up there is to start the release of the flattened paper. These are wonderful little niceties that the Japanese do. Okay, here we are, back to treatment methods and techniques. First I always say conversation rather than conservation. First treatment conservation treatment choice is to clean and stabilize the object. That's the minimum. You always want to do the minimum. Using minor repair techniques with paste and wheat starch, and protective wrappers or boxes. This ensures the selection of the conservation material and its compatibility to the object. The next case study will show you all of this. Okay, so this is Mexican Inquisition documents, consists of 93 original manuscript trial documents from the archives of, well, they don't know where these books came from. They were lost for 200 years, and the scholars were so desperate when they realized they'd surfaced that they came by in their numbers. They are mostly unbound manuscript trial records, and they consist of 93 original manuscripts spanning the years 1525 to 1918. Did you know about the Mexican Inquisition? We've all heard of the Spanish Inquisition. And there were many different hands, as they were recorded by many different scribes as the trial progressed. Inside the leather wrapper, you saw this large trial record was sewn around 2 alum-tawed leather cords, and attached to, here's the satchel, attached to a similar leather binding. Throughout this talk, it's always curious to me how much all these results of how to contain the book or the paper is addressed with the various cultures. So the Mexican Inquisition is the long arm of the Spanish Inquisition. The Carvajal family fled Philip of Spain to the New World. They were denounced as crypto-Jews when they reached the New World. They were burnt at the stake. Although throughout the Mexican Inquisition there are many auto de fe's, very few people were actually burnt. Most of the cases resulted in a confession and a land grab by the inquisitors, consequently. You know, this is sort of why it went on so long. One of the accused hung himself because he didn't want his family to have it. The trial never went ahead, but within the trial record that we have is the hangman's noose, a piece of string that he hung himself, so it's a bit gruesome. But just to show you CMOF pictures, on the left is the cover that you can see would have expanded as the trial got bigger and fatter. And there's 4 volumes that have covers, leather covers like this, or wrappers. There are 2, the Huntington Library and the Mexican Archives, of course, are the 2 other places that have these Mexican Inquisition documents. And so we're the only ones with wrappers. So this is really wonderfully exciting, but I can't confer with anyone. That wasn't so easy. The paper is wrapped to protect it from the acidity of the original leather. This is where Amanda was mentioning that things are hidden or uncovered. Well, here's in our profession, all of us have conservators here, we like to pretend that you can't do the treatments we can do sometimes, because scholars will want us to undo the original object. Sometimes if you do that, you can't put it back together again necessarily. So here they are. These are sold through a tab, and this tab is obviously reuse of paper, because paper was so valuable, like Amanda said. They reused everything. A very expensive commodity, and the ink has eaten through the writing here because it's Angol ink made with gallic acid, whereas some of this is the Western with medieval inks, but some of the Asian inks are made just with soot. I mean, the medieval manual is made with soot, but they add a gallic acid from oak galls to make it acidic. Whereas the condition you'll see when you go this afternoon to the East Asian Library, The condition of the inks in Asian materials is wonderful because they don't use gallic acid. Anyway, on the left are original trial records. I did very little treatments as they were digitized as well. So I felt that use for the original was not going to be as common as other items. And you can see they were done by the scribes who documented the processos trial records and sewed through this tab that they made themselves. And I didn't want to disturb anything, so I used the original holes onto this wrapper, so you could cut off the wrapper and not lose the evidence in the eye scroll. Then, to one of the most interesting discoveries, and this is the codicology that I love about books, and it comes to me not from being a scholar, but from being a practitioner, by looking at what I have in front of me. It's very exciting. And I realized that the waves, which you saw in the two documents together, they were all waving, were not dampness, which I presume, because they've been in a damp environment. They were deliberate folding of the paper. And the reason, in fact, where's a minute? I'll ask you in a minute, but the reason that I was fascinated by this was, I'm not sure legal students understand where this came from, but the scribes would need a margin. And it wasn't quite marginalia, it was actually commentary on the left about the trial, right? Legal comp books today are divided into three so that they write their commentary on the left side. That's what students use. So I looked at these and I went, oh, they've taken that from the Mexican Inquisition. So sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 3. Can you see that difference? This one's 3 on the right. And here's a terrible slide, but I just wanted to show you the quantity. So I had to lay them all out, and I then had to ask the curator how they wanted them contained, because I could put 3 in a box, 2 in a box, whatever they wanted. But basically they were housed. So that was all done here at University of California, Berkeley. So this is what we're all about. Over my years in conservation, working in libraries and institutions, I've come across many cultural different structures. So the Arabic manuscripts, I think that you mentioned too, are in satchels. And I think as a bookbinder, I found it very hard to call things books when they're not bound. So I haven't really got a term yet that we've all agreed with, but single leaves, just the nature of, having these items contained and safe, obviously, and particularly during traveling. Some of these are with the Quran. Oh, this one, I'll show you what this one is. Oops, that's not what I do, sorry. This one, let me just find what this is. Because actually that little white card that's on top of it is what tells me what it is. And I wrote it down. There we go. It was beautiful leather. I don't know what sort of leather. It's in wonderful condition. And it contains a large number of charms written in Arabic and Persian, the stock in trade for an astrologer. So that's what that is. That'll be single leaves. There's a couple more satchels here that I'll show you, and I think we had about 15 varying. And people would travel around with these books, and they would sometimes only take parts of the Quran that they needed to read at the time. So that was why they had wrappers and then satchels and containers. Here's the fun bit. Talk about marginalia. in these Arabic manuscripts, there are these really fun. I mean, this looks like they are, leading a scorpion or something. I've never seen anything like this before. And the next one is, beautiful. They're just lovely. I mean, of course, in medieval manuscripts, I couldn't find my images, but the marginalia, the scribes, perhaps they were bored or something, but the doodles and the scribbles don't always reflect the text. Sometimes, or mostly they do. There's a hand that does this, like, look what's important, things like that. But this is I'd never seen Arabic. This whole collection was digitized and is online for the Alexandria Library. And I think we persuaded them to take the bindings as well, I'm pretty sure, because unfortunately a lot of digitization does not include the bindings. Hold on, I have one more, about the Arabic manuscripts. And again, it's like Amanda says, it's the evidence of how it was made and how it was written and produced. Now this is called a mistara, M-I-S-T-A-R-A. And our profession has never seen them before. They are cards that you put behind your paper, which is dampened and then pressed. This, you can see, I'm going to do something. This beginning, there, behind goes up to the next one, behind goes down to the next one. So you've got strings in a line. And unfortunately, I don't have a picture of that side. But they would press the lines in, they would indent, and then they would do their writing, and it would disappear because the paper dried and flattened. So this is a wonderful example. We just lucked out getting it in the collection. So that's the physical nature of my work. What is a book? To get back to reality, some items are beyond repair. Here's a very brittle book, a classic cloth-bound 20th century problem. Some items are untreatable and have to be replaced or digitized, if they can, as turning these pages only once would break more pages. So, I want to bring you back to the nicer collections rather than the Western 20th century collections. These are paper artifacts from I think Brian says from the 19th century. He's the expert here on campus, Dr. Bowman. And we went to look at these, and I just took snaps just to show you what we have in store, but also printed in black and in red. And you'll see these on your trip this afternoon. And a Mongolian xylograph group of pages is fastened not with a staple, but a rolled piece of paper. So everyone had to contain these single leaves. What were we going to do with them? And they sewed them, a bit like the Chinese, sewn to keep them. But that was for reading. This isn't for reading, because if you tried turning the page, you'd break the paper. So they have to be undone to read. Now, there's a conservator's dilemma again. Do I allow that for scholars? Well, yes, of course, because what's the point of having books if they're not read ultimately? But this tie is made out of rolled paper, which we're going to do tomorrow in the workshop, because we're going to make a Japanese-style binding. Or we'll attempt to do it anyway. Just again, a snapshot, a close-up to show you them, in case you didn't notice. And the other thing that I've lucked out in getting is my friend Jim Canary, who works at the Lilly Library in Indiana. He's an expert on Tibetan books, and he sent me this xylograph woodblock and rubbing. And Amanda suggested I do a rubbing of it to show you if you could see better, but the amount of work in these woodblocks is incredible. The black colouring was made from soot, and I'm not sure these Mongolian books. Angaragsuren, who I hope will help me with all this in the next few days to understand, and Brian, of course, because he can speak Mongolian. Okay, I just thought I'd throw in, our treatments are only good as the materials that are currently available. Unfortunately, we've always wanted a repair material that is strong but gentle, not, flexible. And that's why Japanese paper has been chosen mostly. But I can tell you, you can't find anything. We tried Tyvek, which laminates all the buildings, but it delaminates inside, actually, as it turns and functions. Books generally are difficult. Flat paper is not so hard because it doesn't flex. But turning a page in a book can be damaging itself. So you have to make your repair gentle and appropriate. This is a skin from it. I think this is definitely sheep, maybe goat. You do make vellum. This is to make vellum, and it's a workshop I went to in Oxford, England. You start with the raw material, and then you have to soak it for really 2 or 3 months in lime, which is what they did. They prepared, and they had various. The difference in these blue barrels is various amounts of lime and other combinations that they put in to see what would work and what wouldn't work. So we were grateful, and then Jiri Urak, I think his name is. I should find it. He came with his son, who's on the left there, and they showed us how to make vellum. It was so much fun, I can't tell you. But it was also tremendously enlightening about the material itself. I don't think you can buy vellum still. There's one place, Pergamon vellum making, I think. But there's not many people making vellum now, especially since the House of Lords decided not to do their scrolls on vellum. So now there's no need. I think there is one firm in England still doing it, but I'm just trying to find his name.
Cowsley?
Sorry?
Is it Cowsley?
Cowley.
Cowley.
Cowley, yes. That's right, and they've been there for years, actually. For some reason, I don't have his name. I should do, I feel badly. Okay, I can always find it out if we need to know. So there he is, dehairing it, scraping it down a bowed piece of wood with a bowed knife, that takes off the hair. And there he is, laying it out. It's now dehaired and really sort of thin, a bit like chamois, leather. It's sort of floppy and see-through. And he brought these frames that you would pin it out on, and I've got some samples of vellum tomorrow to show you so that you can see the workings of it. So we pinned them all out, and they were varying skins. Some had been culled, various sort of parks and places around Oxford, and some had been from the slaughterhouse chosen, and they were goat and sheep. You couldn't make vellum out of any skin, really. Buffalo, probably, but it'd be hard. So then we pinned them out and let them dry under tension. And this is why vellum reacts so strongly to moisture. And it has been known that vellum books fly off the shelves when they get too moist, because they suddenly want to revert to what they were, So it will only stay flat under pressure the binding creates this pressure by gluing it to a board around the book. And then, there we are. This is a vellum, culled skin, and talk about holes. You can see this hole is actually the gunshot hole, which killed the animal, and the sort of darker areas are where the animal lay when it had died. So the blood pools, and so you can know what happened to the animal. And you won't get that out of the skin. So you don't really want shot animals. You want them done in an what do you call that? Yes. Well, humanly, not in a slaughterhouse. That's not good enough. So in manuscripts, what helped understand in manuscripts is the sewn holes that you see. So scribes have worked around them, obviously, and you don't think, oh, that was an accident, someone tore the vellum, but you think more about the use to explain the production when you know about it, of course. So we're back to being a conservator and ongoing preservation for collections, which is one part of our remit. And post-treatment care relies on management of environmental controls of humidity and temperature regulation. The irony is, in places like Egypt, the temperature is so constant and dry, humidity is so dry, that the objects don't need the modern temperature controls. However, they have had, even though it's dry, they have had terrible bug infestation at times, which we don't get here, especially not in California. Routine inspections mitigate degradation risks in museums and libraries. There's no point in conserving an artifact if you're going to put it back in an environment that is detrimental to it, So you have to have that in place to spend hours restoring something, A major disaster you need a disaster response plan. We should all have one, even for our house. Like we know, we're in earthquake country. We know how to be prepared. But the disaster response is mostly water damage from malfunctioning pipes, malfunctioning sprinkler system. I don't know, yeah, there's a sprinkler system. And what happens is they give out in the end. And then pipes burst, especially when they have ice in them, and then, when it gets winter. And then, of course, there's firemen. They spray all your collection. Because it's not fire, generally speaking. It isn't burning. Not always, though. And the major disaster we get our information from is the Florence flood. I don't know if you've heard about that in 1966. Conservation really grew out of the Florence flood because of the serialness of practitioners coming in to help treat the collections. They started documentation, and they would have a card on each item. And also to get the pages back to the binding, they had to keep a very strict, catalogue system going. Here's a slide of the disaster response at the library. Which library? I know, I forget. But the Wellcome Library. And it was a burst pipe, and within seconds there was 2 feet of water from this pouring out. And they called the conservation studio in desperation and said, "Oh my God, we've got a leak." I said, "Can't you turn the water off?" And they said, no, we can't find the spigot. So we weren't prepared. But anyway, this is a photographic collection of negatives, some slides, as you can see, and it was a tremendous amount of them. We had to lay them out and put fans. We had some damage inevitably, but it was really good to be able to respond. You know, we were right there on hand. So storage and handling guidelines, custom storage and handling guidelines ensure long-term stability of treatment objects. Many items really are damaged, a bit like the farm, from poor handling. Educated library patrons is an ongoing challenge. But as I've said, what's the point of having objects or books if you can't handle them? I mean, or you can't consult them. That would be wrong. And I've rushed through this because that's who I am. Sorry, I've finished. I hope my 45 years of conservation practice has been entertaining. Thank you.
Angaragsuren Odkhuu is a conservator and fine artist with particular experience in the areas of painting, archaeological findings, textile, and mural painting. He received his BA and MA in Mongolian traditional painting from the University of Arts and Culture in Ulaanbaatar and a Ph.D. in conservation of the mural painting of the decorated ancient tomb from the Human and Environmental Studies at Kyoto University. His research focuses on ancient Mongolian pigments, traditional technology, and the restoration and conservation of the paper-based cultural heritage. He is a conservator at the National Library of Mongolia. And I have to say that last year when we took our teachers to Mongolia, he was very kind to host us for 2 days and show us all of the things at his laboratory, the archives, and the materials. And it was after that meeting, with the help of Maggie Lidroth, who's here from the ACMS, the American Center for Mongolian Studies, we hatched a plan to bring him here to speak to you. So we're thrilled that he is here at Berkeley, and he's going to be working with the Preservation Department for a month, and also here to speak to you and share some of his experience. So, thank you.
Hello, my name is Angaragsuren Odkhuu. I came from Mongolia. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizing institution and to the Institute of East Asian Studies and the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies for inviting me to this event. My presentation is a challenge for methods for a national library. Today I have to talk first a little bit what is the National Library of Mongolia. The second, I want to short introduce the traditional technology of making Boal paper. Boal is the Mongolian name. We call it Boal paper. It means black paper or prepared paper. So on November 19, 1921, the Mongolian People's Government established the Institute of Sutras and scripts. This institution later became the foundation of the National Library of Mongolia. There you can see the first building and the old photos. In 1920, at the meeting of the leadership of the Institute of Science of Regulation of the National Library were approved, and the library was named the State Public Library. Currently, it operates through the central library and branch libraries. There you can see the main building of the National Library of Mongolia and the branch buildings. The central building of the National Library has a total of 6 collections. These include the Mongolian Studies, the manuscript collection, the archival collection, critical collection, Tibetan collection, Eastern and Western collection, and reference reserve collection. The total is 3.5 million books is preserved in our Mongolian National Library. And also our library is preserved many interesting and fascinating book and documentaries preserved. For example, the UNESCO's Asia Pacific Memory of the World Register and the International Memory of the World Registered documents and National Treasure of the Mongolian books and some documents. For example, the Altan pouch is a very well-known book in Mongolia. Lobsang Wandang, who wrote this book, is it 1651. And the Sutra of the 8,000 verses. This fascinating the sutra is made by black pepper. Then 9 jewels they use it on the pepper. Also, bamboo and ganjor is the early 17th centuries, and another very nice interest in the national literature of Mongolia. We preserve it. Now I have to talk about the Bolomol pepper, pepperit pepper, the black pepper. So in Mongolia, the paper used for the book block printing was called Bolomol pepper. While the pepper writing with the 9 precious substances was called Bolomol pepper. You can see the wood block printings and after the printing the books and scripture writing with the 9 precious substances. That one is also made by the Bolomol and the paper, black paper. How did Mongolians prepare Bolomol paper or black paper? First, 2 to 4 sheets of the paper were layered and glued together. This is made. This is because the paper of the wood block printing and the scriptures writing with the 9 precious substance needed to be stick. And this one is the symbol of the black pepper, and also the cross section, the microscope image is showing this slide. You can see the 4 layers of the paper. The one paper is thick is around 0.05 millimeters. So then Bolomol paper's thick is around 0.272, sometimes it's 0.3 millimeter. Preparing the base layer. After the sheets were layered and glued, the step of the polishing the block was carried out. The main base material is sheep brain. Before preparing the sheep heads must be completely cleaned. And the sheep head must be first scalped, cleaned and boiled. Then after removing the meat from the boiled heat, the brain must be removed from the bone whole without any damage. Then pictures showing the cleaning process and the process of the removing and the sheep's brain from the skull. The two guys, the opening the skull. Preparing the base layer. So the sheep brain is dissolved in the water. So then the veins and the other fibrous materials are removed using fine filters. The guys they using fine filter. Shoot is collected from the smoke of the burned wood. The wood is placed in an iron container and tightly covered. And the outside of the iron container is then soft on a fire. And then the iron box is opened and the shoot assimilated inside is carefully collected from the wall or top layers. So then after preparing the base and black pepper is ready. So the fine shoots and sheep brain are mixed together to prepare the main base of the material. The mixture of the sheep brain and shoot is evenly applied to both sides of the layer and glued sheets of the pepper. Finally, the black pepper is completed by carefully polishing it with the smooth around the stone. End of this presentation, the Mongolians have created their unique culture, using materials that were available in their daily life. One sample of this is traditional the black pepper. I have showing the black pepper. You can touch. You can see this. What is the black pepper? This looks is very shiny. We call it Boal pepper. My presentation is finished. Thank you very much.